Chapter 13 of Hunting for Hidden Gold. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. In the depths of the earth. Joe Hardy still had the iron bar in his hand. He had not relinquished his grip on it. That's what caused all the trouble, he said to himself. The sight of the bar reminded him of Frank, still imprisoned back in the tunnel. He knew Frank would have heard the crash and would be wondering what had happened. I may as well set him free first, and then we can reason out what we are going to do. He turned and, dragging the heavy bar behind him, made his way to the opening of the tunnel. When he reached it, he crouched down and proceeded into the passage. With the flashlight illuminating the way, he went on toward the place where his brother was imprisoned. He found that the collapse of the shaft had shaken the entire mine. Bits of rock and heaps of earth and dirt along the floor of the tunnel testified to the shock of the cave-in. But when he came to the place where the tunnel turned to the right, he found, to his surprise, that the turning had vanished. Instead, there was a solid wall of rocks and boulders ahead of him. At first, Joe could not believe his eyes. Then realization dawned on him. The collapse of the shaft had shaken loose the boulders and rocks that lined the tunnel at this point, and they had fallen down to block the passage. He stared incredulously at the rocky wall ahead of him. He was cut off completely from his brother. Then he shouted, "Frank!" There was no answer. His shout echoed and re-echoed in the narrow space of the tunnel. He shouted again and again, but the echoes were his only answers. Once he thought he heard a faint cry from beyond the wall, but he could not be sure. Communication had been cut off. He realized that his peril was doubled now. With the shaft blocked, with the passageway blocked, he was imprisoned underground in a small space where the air would soon become foul and where suffocation would eventually end his life. He set his flashlight on the floor of the tunnel, seized the iron bar, and set to work to remove the blockade. The task seemed hopeless. The rocks were piled up deeply and were so large and so tightly jammed together that it seemed impossible to remove them. Joe knew that if the roof of the tunnel had completely fallen in, there would be little hope, as rock would continue to fall as fast as he removed the rock from underneath. He pried away a huge boulder at the top of the heap and stood to one side as he exerted all the leverage of the iron bar. The great rock wavered, then rolled down the side of the heap into the open tunnel. Joe waited anxiously. To his relief, there was no crash of rock from the top of the tunnel. The removal of the boulder had left a small opening. He shouted again, "Frank, can you hear me?" A surge of gladness passed over him when he heard his brother's voice in reply. "I hear you. What's happened?" "The shaft caved in." "The main shaft?" "Yes." "I heard the crash. I shouted to you, but I didn't hear any answer. Are you hurt?" "No, I'm all right. I jumped back just in time." "Where are you now? Can't you reach me?" "The tunnel caved in too. I'm trying to dig my way through to you." There was a moment of silence. Clearly, the news came as a surprise to Frank. "That's bad," he said at last. "Do you think you can get through?" "I think so. I have the crowbar with me." Joe attacked another rock on the heap, edging the end of the crowbar into the crevice. "How bad is the cave-in?" "Very bad. The whole shaft went." "That means we'll not be able to get out of here." "We may find a way." "Well, try to get through to me first, then we'll see what we're to do." Joe continued his labors at the rock pile. One by one he managed to dislodge heavy rocks and boulders until at last he had cleared away an aperture of sufficient extent to admit the passage of his body. He shoved the crowbar ahead of him and crawled over the remaining rocks. Within a few minutes he had reached his brother, who was lying in the same position in which Joe had last seen him. "How's the foot?" "All right," Frank answered. "It isn't hurting any. See what you can do with that crowbar." Joe inserted the end of the crowbar beneath the boulder, resting the middle of the bar on the boulder beneath. Then, exerting all his strength, he weighed down on the bar. Slowly, gradually, the great rock began to move. "It's giving way," cried Frank. "Just a little more. A little more." By means of the bar and the principles of leverage, Joe was able to apply much more strength to the removal of the boulder than if he had tried to move it with his bare hands. He shifted his grasp, bore down on the bar again, and the great boulder rose higher. "Good," declared Frank, dragging himself forward. "I'm free." He extricated his foot from the crevice, and Joe lessened his weight on the bar. The boulder fell back into place again, but Frank was no longer a prisoner. "That's that," Frank ejaculated, scrambling to a sitting position and beginning to rub his ankle to restore circulation. "I'm out of that little jam anyway, thanks to you and that crowbar." Joe sat down on a nearby rock. "We're up against a worse dilemma now," he said. Frank looked grave. "I know it. Still, there may be a way out. You say there's no use trying to get back up the shaft?" "None at all. The whole place caved in with a crash." "What caused it?" "That crowbar had evidently been left there to prop up a weak place in the side of the shaft, and when I moved it, the whole thing gave way. Some of the rocks came tumbling out, and then the side of the shaft caved in. If I hadn't jumped back in the nick of time, my goose would have been cooked. There must be a couple of tons of rock in the shaft now." "We couldn't dig our way through?" Joe shook his head. "We'd be wasting our time trying. I guess the only thing we can hope for is that somebody heard the crash and comes to see what happened." "But they don't know we're down here." "That's true, too, and they won't be very likely to start clearing away the shaft unless they know we're here. This mine was abandoned a long time ago, by the looks of things. They might see our footprints up to the side of the shaft. It was snowing when we came here. They may be covered over by now." The boys were silent. They realized that their plight was almost hopeless. In the cold, dark depths of the earth, with their air supply cut off, they were facing suffocation, exposure, and starvation, and there seemed not the slightest possibility of escape. "The only thing to do," said Frank at last, "is to keep on following this tunnel. There's no use going back into the mine itself." "No, there's no use going back, but to my mind, I don't think there's any use going ahead either. This tunnel probably ends in a blank wall." "We might as well find out. We won't do ourselves any good by just sitting here and waiting to die." Frank got to his feet and picked up his flashlight. "Better turn out your light," he advised. "We only need one light at a time, and we might as well be saving the batteries." Joe got up and did as his brother had suggested. Frank went on down the passage, followed by Joe. The boys felt in their hearts that there was very little hope that the passage would lead anywhere, but it seemed to be the only possible avenue of escape. They recognized that it was only a drift that the miners had dug and blasted away from the main workings in an effort to discover a vein of gold, and the fact that it had not been further developed seemed to indicate that the search had been unsuccessful and that the drift had been abandoned. "I wish we had told Dad exactly where we were going today," said Frank as they went slowly down the tunnel. "So do I. There'd be a chance for us then. They'd send someone out to look for us, and then they could start to work clearing away that shaft." "Well, we can be thankful we weren't in the shaft when it collapsed." "Yes, it could have been worse. If I had been caught in the cave-in, you would be lying under that boulder yet." "We still have a chance as long as we have that crowbar and can keep moving." Frank paused. "By the way, do you feel a draft?" "Seems to me I do feel cold air." "Perhaps there's an opening to this tunnel. That seems promising." The rush of cold air about their heads was soon quite evident. The boys' spirits rose forthwith, and they proceeded through the tunnel more cheerfully. "If air can get into this place, we should be able to get out of it," said Frank. "Perhaps this tunnel is just another entrance to the mine." "Let's hope so." They continued, Frank flashing the light before him. The tunnel began to grow narrower. They had to crouch almost double in order to avoid bumping their heads on the rocky roof. "Another minute or so, and we'll know whether this place has an opening or not," called back Frank. "It must have an opening. Where would that fresh air we feel be coming from if it hadn't one?" "It might be coming through a small slit in the rocks. We can't depend on it too much. Ah, here we are." His light had disclosed the fact that they were at the end of the tunnel, but his tones immediately changed to a murmur of disappointment when he saw that the tunnel ended in a sheer wall of cold, wet rock. The boys crouched in silence, gazing at the rock wall that seemed to crush all their hopes. The wall was a barrier that cut them off from all chance of reaching the sunlit outside world again. "It's a blind alley," said Joe in a hushed voice. Frank merely nodded. He had been buoying up his hopes by refusing to admit to himself that the tunnel could be anything else than an outlet to the mine. Now he was overwhelmed by disappointment. "We're up against it," he said at last. "This tunnel leads nowhere, and the shaft is blocked." "I'm afraid so." Joe tapped the crowbar tentatively against the wall of rock. It thudded dully. There was no hollow sound that might indicate another tunnel beyond. The dull ring of the iron bar seemed to sound their death knell. "I guess this is our finish, Frank," he said gravely. End of chapter 13.